Tonight we are here to award the 2012 Dale Brown Book Award. The award is given to a book and its author that is judged by a panel of judges to advance Anabaptist and or Pietist studies most significantly for the year in which it's selected. This year, Keith Graber Miller receives the 2012 award for his book, Prophetic Peacemaking, Selected Writings of J.R. Burkholder. It's published by Herald Press in conjunction with the Institute of Mennonite Studies at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. The author of the essays, J.R. Burkholder, is also here. We're honored that his wife Sue could also travel here with him. And Keith Graber Miller will give the address, and then J.R. Burkholder will make some comments afterwards, and we'll have a time of questions and discussion. Following the lecture and the discussion time, we invite all of you to stay for refreshments and a reception, an informal time of conversation. There are some copies of Keith's book available for sale. You could get autographs while you're here. And we also have other books for sale. We have a guest book on a table in the lobby. We'd be very honored if you would sign that to let us know you're here. There are copies of the Young Center's newsletter there in case you want to take that along. It's free. If you'd like to sign up to receive it and you don't receive it, if you'll just put a check mark by your name when you sign the guest book, we'll send you a copy. And we don't ask you for money, and the copy is for free. It only comes out twice a year, so you won't be bombarded with the junk mail. But instead, we'll alert you to opportunities to hear other speakers like we'll hear tonight. So at this time, I'd like to present the Dale Brown Book Award itself to Keith Graber Miller, and then invite him to lecture to us tonight. So Keith, in recognition for your work this year and your publication, we are happy to present to you the Dale Brown Book Award for 2012.
Good evening. Good evening. Having almost irreparably destroyed my Mennonite soul by attending an other than Mennonite college, I was Anabaptized and redeemed several years later by choosing to go to Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary, now Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. And among the multiple mentors I encountered there was J.R. Burkholder, with whom I took a Latin American liberation theology class back in the fall of 1985, a course in which he graciously burst open my theological world, which contributed to my salvation and quite literally taught me everything I knew about liberation theology at that point in my education. 5 years later, as I did my dissertation research on the 20th-century peacemaking and politicization of North American Mennonites, I kept bumping up against J.R.'s presence and writings at 1960s conferences discussing Mennonite peace witness, in critiques of traditional Mennonite non-resistance, in his ecumenical involvements in the 1980s, and in Burkholder's own published and unpublished pieces that seemed both prophetic and pastoral, descriptive and prescient, tradition-embedded and expansive, locally grounded and international in scope. I was convinced then, as I am now, that from among the multiple ethicists, theologians, sociologists, and historians facilitating or reflecting on 20th century transformations in Mennonite peace theology and social engagement, J.R. most nearly got it right in terms of both his ethical analysis and his personal practice. And since that time, I've been proud to declare myself not only a Christian and a Mennonite, but also, to be more specific, a Burkholderian. Leo Dreger and Don Crable, in their now older but still informative text, Mennonite Peacemaking from Quietism to Activism, tease out the sociological categories of ideological brokers and change agents. Ideological brokers are esteemed leaders who try to reconcile the legacy of historic beliefs with changing conditions. Within the church, these ideological brokers are typically theologians, scholars, and elders. Such leaders, negotiating between traditional convictions and new social realities, often follow change agents, professors in the classroom, change-minded leaders, and especially activists on the street who've already blazed new trails. What Burkholder and several key others of his generation did was fuse these roles of ideological broker and change agent, making commitments to faithful thinking, faithful pedagogies, and faithful living, participating in assorted civil rights and peace and justice movements, and then returning to campus or churchly offices and reflecting on those experiences. Where Burkholder was successful in facilitating, alongside other social change agents and thinkers, transformations, where he was successful in facilitating these transformations in the Mennonite world, that success was grounded in the engaged reflection. Latin American liberation theologians often speak about the action-reflection cycle, or the praxis cycle, the movement from, first of all, a lived reality to, secondly, careful observation and analysis of what that reality is and who's affected by it, to thirdly, a thoughtful critique of that reality, drawing on the Bible and other wisdom sources, and finally, to a new concrete engagement with the reality, sometimes challenging and sometimes affirming it. All of these steps lead toward a new reality or new event which pushes the cycle forward again. Although J.R. seems genetically engineered toward a life of engaged reflection, he learned about the action-reflection cycle as a concept through interaction with Latin American liberationists in Brazil and Costa Rica. Later, he both modeled and disseminated that concept for generations of students at Goshen College and Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary. 2 decades after I first encountered J.R. in his AMBS course, I invited him to lecture in my Goshen College Liberation Theologies class, now pluralized to include feminist, womanist, black, and other perspectives. I invited him in to talk about his own Latin American encounters, from assisting with an interdenominational student work camp in the slums of Rio de Janeiro in 1955, while the Latin American Catholic bishops were having their first foundational Selam meetings in the city, to in 1971 leading Goshen College's SST program in Costa Rica just as the first liberation theology texts were emerging, to in the 1980s guiding delegations of Mennonite leaders to Central America during the debates about U.S. support for Nicaraguan Contras, those who were fighting the Sandinistas, as some of you may remember. These experiences clearly shaped the direction of J.R.'s teaching and writing, just as his world awareness informed every sermon, lecture, and public presentation he's given. As Prophetic Peacemaking indicates, Burkholder has always been concrete in his thought, always directing his reflections to specific issues, nearly always beginning his papers with references to the headlines of the day. During a critical half-century of transition, J.R. helped Mennonites move away with integrity beyond the sometimes passive quietism of an earlier era toward a cautious yet faithful engagement with the world. And he did so by building bridges, without dismissing the value of the core peace convictions of his Anabaptist Mennonite faith, without selling the Mennonite soul to Reinhold Niebuhrian-style compromise and political realism, as did some of his intellectual peers, and without uncritically accepting all of the rhetoric of the Christian and secular left. After a short stint as a missionary, J.R., soon to be faculty on Goshen, worked part-time with Fellowship of Reconciliation in Philadelphia, rubbing shoulders with many of the nation's primary peace movement leaders. In 1959, he participated in a months-long vigil at Fort Detrick, Maryland, protesting the preparation of and production of germ warfare. Soon afterward, he helped organize Philadelphia's first Ban the Bomb March. By the late 1950s, before I was even born, he was an activist several days a week, marching and vigiling and courting arrest when few others were. Now into his 9th decade of life, J.R. participates regularly in Goshen's vigil remembering the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, a vigil where each week participants read aloud the names of U.S. soldiers killed over the last 7 days and delineate bombings, shootings, and terrorist strikes in Afghanistan where nationals have died. But already back in 1960, he challenged the Mennonite Theological Study Group at a conference in Chicago with a paper making a case for radical nonviolent action grounded in Anabaptist theology. It's hard to imagine now, perhaps, how radical that was at its time. That paper, titled Radical Pacifism Challenges the Mennonite Church, was years ahead of its time. Written by the 31-year-old Burkholder, who was then practicing the trade of wallpapering very near here in Lancaster, PA. The typed version of the piece included an attached note saying that the article wasn't meant to be a definitive statement, but instead a query to stimulate thinking and discussion about Mennonite peace theology and practice. Although today, non-payment of taxes that go for warfare or refusal to register with selective service systems, such as it is now, and nonviolent direct action are commonly accepted, though occasionally challenged, but they're commonly accepted options for Anabaptist peace activists. A half-century ago, those generally considered beyond the pale in the Mennonite peacemaking portfolio. Circulated only in mimeographed form and then relegated to archives, Radical Pacifism Challenges the Mennonite Church was first published in the text we're celebrating this evening, one of 30 insightful essays included in the book, pieces written over a half-century by J.R., essays that we believe still speak to those of us hoping to welcome God's reign. 16 years after the delivery of that seminal speech, Burkholder wrote Witness to the State, which he presented at a Goshen College conference that also included Philip and Daniel Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister, radical Catholic activists who were part of the Catonsville Nine, a group that had walked into the Catonsville, Maryland draft office on May 17, 1968, then carried about 600 1A selective service files into the parking lot and burned them with homemade napalm. At the time of Burkholder's 1976 presentation, Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign was in full swing, revolutions were afoot in many Latin American countries, and nuclear buildups continued in the U.S. and also in the Soviet Union. Less than a decade later, Burkholder delivered the 1984-85 C. Henry Smith Peace Lecture titled Talking Back to Caesar, the Christian Witness to the State. The realities of the Ronald Reagan years, the lecture was delivered just days after Reagan's re-election in 1984, but that reality and the rise of the religious right in the U.S. no doubt contributed to Burkholder's sense of urgency in speaking to government. As a professor, scholar, missionary, minister, and social activist, J.R. has spent, as I implied earlier, much of his life bridging worlds, pastoring a very conservative Mennonite congregation several days a week, while spending the remaining days working with Fellowship of Reconciliation, doing Mennonite mission work in Brazil, while working with hyper-evangelical missionary colleagues, as well as emerging revolutionary and liberationist movements, stretching himself intellectually between the appeals of sectarianism, the kind of narrow way, and the attraction of broad-minded Christian humanism. Teaching at a relatively safe liberal arts campus while participating in public actions related to war making. Being embedded in Mennonite institutions while spending extensive time in ecumenical conversations. Retiring and yet keeping his finger on the pulse of the community and world. Throughout his life, J.R. has lived with these and other creative tensions, and much of his productivity and insight can be credited to living between worlds. As he said in Radical Pacifism, to suggest that our present position is not adequate is in no way meant to depreciate the significant work for peace that our church already is doing. But we must ask if something else is not needed, some way to put our concerns squarely before the nation and the world in a dramatic and forceful way. Or as he said in his C. Henry Smith Peace Lecture, in trying to be faithful to the Great Commission, Mennonites have been forced into painful awareness of just how pervasive and determinative are the actions or neglects of government in affecting the lives of people we care about, next door or across town or around the world. It's not a partisan political act when overseas missionaries or service workers seek hearings with congresspersons to testify about human rights or African famine, but an expression of justice and mercy. It's simply been the result, he said, of efforts to respond faithfully to the needs of suffering human beings whom we have encountered in the amazing expansion of our mission and service activity. It was clear to Burkholder that Mennonites' re-entry into the broader social and political world had been elicited out of the faith-based extension of their service involvements in North America and around the world, practices that took them beyond where their previous theological and ethical frameworks had allowed. It's a perspective. This perspective is one that I worked with extensively in my Emory University doctoral dissertation when I looked at the founding and evolution of Mennonite Central Committee's Washington, D.C. Advocacy Office. The most significant contribution that MCC Washington makes in the capital is bringing itinerating service workers to Washington, people who've spent years on the ground in hot spots around the world, allowing those serving in those settings to tell what they've observed and on occasion to offer counsel about U.S. international policy. Clearly, legislators were interested in hearing what those authentic MCC workers had to say. As a scholar, J.R. has been more of a fox than a hedgehog, to use the bestiary of political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. Hedgehogs know one big thing, and they apply that one big thing everywhere they look, dismissing opposing views and making top-down arguments deduced from that one idea. Foxes, in contrast, dart here and there, knowing many things, considering various competing viewpoints, and making bottom-up inductive arguments while doubting the power of the one big idea. Now, that's J.R., and it's an additional part of what it means to be a Burkholderian. In the cluttered home office that J.R. colonized decades ago, a space that was originally designated as a dining room, one can observe the fox in his natural habitat. Nearly every square foot of space is covered with one of 5 desks, all of which are stacked with bookshelves nearly to the ceiling, a wooden table covered with loose papers and boxes or files, 5 4-drawer filing cabinets overstuffed with a lifetime of newspaper clippings, lecture notes, drafts of presentations and articles, and files of correspondence, or loose boxes and papers, most of which J.R. has been sorting through during the 5 years that we worked on the book and the 2 years since it first came out. It's a lot of work to go through that stuff. In his living room, which functions as J.R.'s more leisurely reading space, visitors find Burkholder surrounded by newspapers, magazines, and journals. Mennonite Quarterly Review, the New Yorker, Atlantic, Mennonite World Review, the Goshen News, Smithsonian, Newsweek, Harvard Magazine, Sojourners. The recent media are stuffed between and around books of all sorts. At any given time, Burkholder is reading 6 to 8 texts, shifting from one to the other. When I was writing the introduction to Prophetic Peacemaking, J.R.'s in-process volumes included a recent page-turner by James Douglas titled JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. Rodney Clapp's Johnny Cash and the Great American Contradiction, Christianity in the Battle for the Soul of a Nation. Adam Hochschild's King Leopold's Ghost, a story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa. In honor of Mennonite World Conference coming up in South America at the time, he was revisiting Willard and Verna Smith's 1950 book, Paraguayan Interlude, and Dom Helder Camara's The Conversions of a Bishop. He'd met the famed liberationist bishop during one of his Latin American sojourns, he explained, and he remembered the power of that encounter. Rounding out the season's collection, then, were a 1949 series of science fiction stories for an occasional nostalgia trip, Brian D. McLaren's The Last Word and the Word After That, a tale of faith, doubt, and a new kind of Christianity, and Walter Clausen and William Clausen's epic Marpeck, A Life of Dissent and Conformity. Rich reading from many different fields and disciplines. Similarly, J.R.'s writings have been episodic and eclectic. We might have called this book Eclectic Peacemaking rather than Prophetic Peacemaking. Those of us who know him well know that J.R.'s mind is always and always has been exceedingly fertile, so fertile that he sometimes plants crops on top of other crops, with multiple overlapping vegetation growing at the same time. Even in his speech patterns and class lectures, J.R. commonly slips from one uncompleted sentence into a sideline, and then a tangent, and then a story, and then an apology for not completing the original thought. Over the course of his decades of teaching, church work, and writing, J.R. frequently moved on to another paper or presentation without seeing the previous one through to publication, which is partly why so many of his ever profound insights have remained unpublished. It's clear, though, that even while foxily darting to and fro, Burkholder has burrowed deeply into the various dimensions of peace theology and peace practice throughout his career. Significant sections of the book trace out J.R.'s particular Anabaptist-based pacifist convictions and his perspective on Christians' witness to the state, as already noted. But J.R. also addresses other dimensions of Mennonite social and personal ethics in his book, or this book. He was an early contributor to Anabaptist discussions of healthcare ethics. He wrote a major piece on biblical faith and investment. We've also included in Prophetic Peacemaking a short section of J.R.'s Harvard University dissertation, which also was unpublished. It deals with marginal religious movements in the courts, a study that's been picked up and used by sociologists over the last 40 years. A chunk of it was picked up and published in an edited book shortly after the dissertation came out, and that has been used and referenced in a number of sociological texts since then. We've also included a film and book review of The Mission, a thought piece on Christian vocation, and an article on machismo, one of his only forays into gender or sexuality issues. J.R., I think, is forever befuddled that as his mentee, I picked up more on the ethics of sexuality and then ran with it, rather than staying grounded in other forms of peacemaking. He still can't figure out how that happened. We also included a recent Gerardian examination of worship beyond altar and sacrifice. There, Burkholder says, we need to do more than recover the power of disciplined living as the token of proper worship. We also must give more attention to the modalities of praise that harmonize rather than clash with other dimensions of worship. But ultimately, he says, that necessary sense of reverence, of mystery, of transcendent glory that characterizes authentic worship must be balanced alongside the admonitions to the writer, from the writer of the Hebrews, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. J.R.'s words, of course, are made authentic by a life lived in the spirit of doing good. We get a window into that life through Prophetic Peacemaking's 2 autobiographical and framing chapters, essays that trace out J.R.'s intellectual biography initially, and then close with his reflections on the social change agent component of his 3 lifetime roles: academic, church person, and activist. A child of the Great Depression, young J.R. was soon enamored with the clouds of war looming over 1930s Europe, a fascination that continued for some 7 years. While he wasn't enamored with war-making, he says, what grabbed him were the planes. He was in love with flying, so there he was, daydreaming and scrawling sketches of P-38s and P-51s, zapping Messerschmitts and Jap Zeros, enduring high school because, as he saw it then, all the real men had gone off to war. Following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which came when J.R. was an impressionable late adolescent, a new perspective began to dawn for him. And from there, J.R. traces out 14 lessons learned on the way toward peacemaking. Among them, a few of them are, number one, don't assume that everyone caught up in the military ethos is inspired by murderous motives. He's talking about himself. Number two, you don't help people grow by embarrassing them. This was a reference to his playing Gandhi in a junior high school play, picked not because he was an admirable pacifist at that time, but probably because he was the skinniest kid in the class. Number three, the family of pacifist Christians has a long history and a global and ecumenical embrace. Anabaptists don't have the corner on pacifism. Number seven, it's a good idea to give people, especially young people, some room to learn and grow. Lord knows, he adds, I needed it. Number nine, the war system, not the soldier, is the enemy. Many of us now say, he says, support our troops, bring them home now. And number 14, networking, making connections with folks from diverse backgrounds and organizations is essential. These are lessons well worth learning from one who's experienced much of life. Collaborating with J.R. to bring this text to fruition has been a gift to me, a blessing in the authentic and robust sense of that word. This book is partly about honoring our mentor and friend, a true participant observer in transformations in Mennonite peace theology over the last 60 years. This collection of essays also is an up-close and personal examination of that unfolding theological development. So it has value as a documentation of broader Anabaptist, Mennonite, and ecumenical peace history as well. But ultimately, J.R. and I intend for these essays to function not simply as period pieces, but as reflections on faithful living that are yet relevant for future generations of peacemakers. In his modeling and teaching, J.R. inspired scores of students and colleagues toward peacemaking vocations. And I believe his voice still resonates for 21st century followers of the one Christians call Prince of Peace. This book needed to be published for the sake of the church and the sake of the world. In his last year of teaching at Goshen College, Burkholder wrote a short piece on ethics for the Record, the student newspaper. After returning from 2 years away at the Dallas Peace Center, J.R. acknowledged that he had to pause and ask himself again whether teaching really makes any difference in moral behavior. Does teaching really make any difference in moral behavior? Echoing Stanley Hauerwas's recently published text, A Community of Character, I should say as an aside, Stanley Hauerwas is one who published every single thought he ever had. He publishes a lot, for those of you who have read Stanley Hauerwas. And one of his friends and colleagues said, at least it's an apocryphal statement, that when they were told that something about Stanley writing everything he'd ever thought, said, and some of the things he's published weren't even thought yet. But echoing Stanley Hauerwas's recently published text, A Community of Character, recently at that time, J.R. described character as the development of a consistent structure of behavior, a lifestyle, which is made up of the cumulative effect of countless decisions, choices, and acts, some of them carefully thought through and others not. He spoke about those who rescued the Jews during World War II and about conscience and about the importance of finding appropriate reference groups. And then he added, what does all of this tell us? He's writing for the Goshen College Record. First, start behaving now the way you want to live the rest of your life. And second, choose carefully the kind of community or moral reference group that you want to be identified with. And why not consider the character of Jesus and the community of his disciples? What could be more Burkholderian or more Christian than that? J.R. and I both are immensely grateful for the honor of winning this year's Dale Brown Book Award, the icing on a markedly pleasurable publishing cake, it must have been a chocolate one, of producing a book that we believe is relevant for historians and sociologists and peacemakers and others seeking to understand the evolving Anabaptist tradition. In that spirit, our hope is that prophetic peacemaking helps younger and older readers alike reflect more carefully on their calling in the world and embed themselves more deeply in faithful communities so that, together with others, they can make life-giving, integrity-filled choices, ones that make for peace. Thank you.
Wow. How can anyone respond to such a flattering portrait? I hardly recognize the character. Thank you, Pete. However, we're living in days of political debates, of instant fact-checking, concerns about truthiness. I think I'm obliged to inform you that while most everything Keith said is true, it's not the whole truth. He skipped over the false starts, the detours, the dead ends. A lot of things can go wrong in 80-plus years, especially for foxes who, as he says, can't stick with the one sure thing. But I'm grateful to be here to see a number of old friends and newer acquaintances. And at the heart of things, I'm indeed grateful that Keith got this crazy idea that such a book ought to happen. And I'm honored that it's now out there, even if it's not on anyone's bestseller list. And I'm very pleased that the Young Center made this selection. But I have to emphasize that the evening, quite appropriately, honors Keith, who labored for years on this thankless task of gathering, selecting, editing, especially creating the important and thorough introductions that put each essay in its proper context. That work is so essential because the value of this book is not what you might learn about me, but a sampling of what I have learned over these 6 decades as Keith noted, a participant observer. Someone trying to understand the interplay of church and world from a progressive Anabaptist perspective. I'm grateful for this event. However, I lament the fact that the one for whom it is named, Dale Brown, cannot be with us. It's not just the absence of a wonderful friend, but also the recognition that Dale is one of those group of special people who also belong in this story. My friends, colleagues, and mentors from the Church of the Brethren. We're here this evening, this event, sponsored at Elizabethtown College. And so I think it's important for me to call attention to several graduates of Elizabethtown College who had a special impact on my story. All 3 of them began college way back in the 1930s. So probably most of you in this room won't even recognize the names. All the more reason I'd like to call attention to them. The first is Millard Richard Shaw, a young Presbyterian from York County, from a farm family, who at 16 started college at Elizabethtown on a full scholarship. graduated in 1938, went on to Princeton Seminary, became a missionary serving in Colombia and in Brazil, and eventually to a distinguished chair of ecumenical theology at Princeton Seminary. It was Dick Shaw who unwittingly came to my rescue in the 1950s when I was floundering around trying to figure out what I ought to be doing in Brazil. And Sue and I were together in this enterprise, and 2 daughters who were born in Brazil. But in that first months when we were in the language school in Campinas, Brazil, Dick Shaw was teaching at the Presbyterian Seminary. And we actually discovered each other at school mailboxes when we recognized that we were apparently the only people there who were getting the familiar paper wrappers that delivered the Christian Century from Chicago. That led to my initiation into progressive ecumenical circles in Brazil, contacts with the international student movement, and actually my flirtation for a while, thinking of applying for service with the Presbyterians at a time of personal frustration with Mennonite bureaucracy. But that's another story. My second mentor from Elizabethtown also began college here on a full scholarship in the late 1930s. Charles C. Walker came from a Quaker Methodist family near Gap out in the eastern edge of Lancaster County. During those college years, as war broke out in Europe, Charlie Walker began hanging out with the convinced Brethren pacifists on campus. He served with the Brethren peace team, and after graduation in 1941, he stretched beyond the Brethren, most of the Brethren and Mennonites of that time, refusing to cooperate at all with the military draft, and spent part of the war years in prison. I first met Charlie Walker in 1958 in Philadelphia, where he was the regional executive on the staff of the Philadelphia FOR, where I spent 2 days a week, as Keith mentioned. Those 2 years that illustrate my contrarian tendencies of split personality and foxy directions, going on ban the bomb marches around the city and joining with ecumenical radicals for several days of the week, and then pastor of a fairly conservative congregation. Those Philadelphia years led to the vigil at Fort Deeping that I can't help but show off here, because my name is, along with Charlie Walker's, at the bottom of this poster. 1958. It's one of the experiences that led to the 1960 Radical Pacifist essay. Charlie Walker had been a necessary, indispensable guru in that period of time. And Keith notes in the introduction to the chapter how that happened. Now, the third E-Town person from that World War II generation doesn't get named in the book, but he's present in the background to some of those who are in the story. Ernest W. Lefevre, actually the only one of the 3 who came from the Church of the Brethren. He was a classmate of Charlie Walker's, was involved in the ongoing campus debate on war peace issues in those years, Dale Brown has more than once referenced Lefebvre's influence on his own early years. Lefebvre's connection to our book is Chapter 11, the essay Pacifist Ethics and Pacifist Politics, published by the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which was created and then headed by Ernest Lefebvre in those mid-70 years. The irony of that story is that by the 1970s, Lefebvre had turned from pacifism to what he termed a kind of human realism. But these are just a few glimpses into the kind of encounters that help shape the material, the moments, the stories behind this book. Where are we now? What next? What is the ongoing story of prophetic peacemaking? Because I want to assure you that my understanding of that title is that the prophetic peacemaker is not me, it's the people and events that I'm writing about. What are the issues that are still with us? I'm watching as new configurations emerge in our 21st century world. And I'm probably having problems with that because I discover again and again that a good bit of my thought is still stuck in the 20th century. As I look at the people I've been fascinated with, the courageous, heroic, even stubborn people like Charlie Walker or others who get named in the book, the Berrigans, Martin Luther King, and so forth, they are often such lonely figures. In contrast, some of us have wanted to underline the distinctiveness of the Peace Church witness, which is a collective, a community, a seedbed, a nursery, a sustaining milieu that can carry forward a countercultural witness. Because, let's face it, the kind of peace and justice activity we're talking about is a minority in our world. I find it interesting that on today's public scene, there seem to be few outstanding individuals. If you look at what is perhaps the most significant secular public event in recent times, it's Occupy. But can anyone name a prominent leader in the Occupy movement? Or even the emerging church? Again, perhaps we are at another one of those shifts in social cultural events. So, with whatever time and energy I have left, I want to stay tuned to continue to be a witness to what is going on. Okay, it's your turn. Questions, comments, whatever.
At this time, we'll entertain questions or comments, points of discussion you would like to raise, either for J.R. or for Keith, and we'll have them answer as you wish. We'll try to talk them into speaking into the microphone so we can all hear. But what comments would you like to make?
Also talking to the microphone, so you have to come on over here.
Yes.
I'm not sure who to direct this to. I haven't read the book, I confess, but I will, I promise. The question, maybe I'll go to J.R. first, and maybe it's discussed in the book, but when your formulations of radical peacemaking were emerging in the 60s and 70s, the social ethicist of the Mennonite Church was Guy Hirschberger. War, peace, and non-resistance, not peacemaking, non-resistance. I'm curious what kind of conversations you had with him, with Guy Hirschberger, what kind of pushback he gave to you, because you were really going in a different direction.
Did all of you hear the question? Okay.
That's a good one. And yes, I lived through those years. Keith came along a bit later, although, yeah, you met Guy in his later years.
I knew Guy in his later years, yes.
Yeah. I never had Guy as a teacher during my college years at Goshen, but he was, of course, as you mentioned, the major peace thinker, leader at the denominational level for several generations. And the phrase that characterized that, in fact, it's, where's Don Crable? It's part of the title, you asked, part of the title of the of your book with Leo Grieger, right? From non-resistance to no, I forget the title, but you...
From non-resistance to peacemaking.
From non-resistance to peacemaking. Yeah, and the interesting thing about Guy, who lived into his early 90s, is that I saw him evolve, as we all do in various ways, from that early book, which went through several editions and was quite reprinted a number of times and influential. He, for example, it would have been in the late 1950s, I guess, when he, or maybe even early, he made a trip with several others through the South as the civil rights movement was developing. Keith, you may know this story better, and had developed first-hand acquaintance with Martin Luther King and with those around him. And while he continued to ask insightful questions about what they were doing, he shifted and recognized that there were other ways of shaping the witness, of being faithful to Jesus, but finding new ways to engage the world.
Yeah, and just a couple of quick follow-ups on that. I mean, Guy not only went to for those who don't know Guy Hirschberg, those of you who may be younger, Guy was a Mennonite church leader, teaching at Goshen College, teaching sociology and history, who did have a much more quietistic perspective back in the 40s and 50s, certainly. And then J.R. is kind of tracing out the shift. When he went to the South, when Guy went to the South, he one of the stories about that is him sitting down with a couple of other Mennonite church leaders and a couple of African-American vigilers, I don't know if they were Mennonites or not at that time, at a restaurant in Atlanta, and they wouldn't serve them their meal because they said they couldn't, well, they could serve the whites, but they couldn't serve the blacks who were at the table. And they said, that's fine. And they ordered their food and just ordered extra amounts. And then they shared the plates and shared their silverware as a way of sort of a quiet protest in that context. And then as J.R. was moving us toward, because he learned to know Martin Luther King Jr., he was the one who had invited Martin Luther King Jr. to campus in 1960, before King was as popular or as well accepted certainly into Mennonite circles. King didn't, my understanding of the history is that King didn't actually become quite as popular until Malcolm X came along, but among whites, until Malcolm X came along. And then given the choice between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the whites embraced Martin quite avidly. But in the introduction to the chapter on radical pacifism, here's one brief note. After J.R. wrote this piece, Oriel Miller, who was Mennonite Central Committee Executive Secretary at the time, privately noted his favorable reaction, writing to Guy F. Hirschberger that there might be, this is a quote, there might be place for for the quiet vigil witness. So he was getting a favorable, Guy was getting a favorable response to this presentation from Ori Miller, another prominent church leader at the time.
Other questions?
I haven't read the book either. I promise I will. I'm curious. I guess I'll direct this to Keith. What did J.R. write about machismo, and how did you run with that? Did you take that into a feminist essay? Did you
No.
Okay.
But in the text, I mean, for those who haven't read it yet, we basically left J.R.'s writing intact, except we used inclusive language everywhere. When J.R. was writing, most of his writings did not use inclusive language because people hadn't thought of it yet. And so we changed that, and we did substantially edit some things down. There was some overlap in his essays. And so some things were significantly edited out so there wouldn't be too much redundancy or repetition in the various essays. But he's able to speak his piece about those things. And this machismo piece, he was talking about, what's the exact title of it? Starving our macho instincts. It was starving our macho instincts. And it was about men sort of changing their perspective somewhat. I mean, responding to feminist critiques that were emerging at the time too, and men behaving better than they had been before that time. It was a short essay. As I said, was as far as I've seen in conversations with J.R., I think that was his only reach over into sort of gender politics and to the feminist movement.
When you were pastoring and also doing activism, how did you combine those so that you could be pastor to those who questioned what you were doing, yet faithful to your activism? When you're part of an institution, what pressure did you get not to do what you felt called to do?
Can you repeat the question real quick? The question is, how did he combine his pastoral work and his activism, and how did he relate to people who might have been critical of that or embraced it, and also asking him to reflect on how that plays out in an institutional position too?
Those are appropriate. Those are appropriate questions, and I have to answer. How did I handle it? Not well. I was still learning. I hadn't planned to get into that situation, and I'd say it probably accounts for my contrary sides going at each other ever since, but we don't need to psychoanalyze all that. I don't, Sue, for what it's worth, I don't remember that there was much overlap. The church people didn't care or didn't know what I was doing. 2 days ago, we didn't very often talk about it. I was already pushing their edges, and the truth is, that's one of those parts of the story that Keith's very flattering account doesn't deal with, that into the second year, my term was coming to an end at the church. Enough said.
Maybe one more question, yes.
J.R., I recall your being at our church one Sunday morning and preaching a pretty powerful message on evangelism. It sort of surprised me. But it seemed as though you had something of a holistic approach there. How do you see this prophetic peacemaking witness tied to your understanding and commitment to evangelism?
Well, I like to say I learned it all from Jesus. But the way that I apply it, I learned from the world around me. And I'm not at all sure that I've been able to put that together well. That's one reason I keep questioning and speaking and writing and asking people for feedback.
Okay, thank you. I think at this time we'll bring to a close our formal presentation and discussion, but I want to invite all of you to stay for refreshments and the reception to honor Keith, and also to welcome J.R. and Sue here in our midst, and we can continue conversation during that time as well. I will ask in a moment after we give a round of applause for Keith and J.R. to go to the table so that as you go out there you can visit with them, and if people want autographs they can get them, but that way we'll keep all of the traffic moving and we won't block up here in the doorway. It is indeed an honor to have J.R. Burkholder here tonight, and to honor Keith Graber Miller for his book, Prophetic Peacemaking, the edited edition of J.R.'s writings. It's been a great opportunity to celebrate J.R.'s career and also to realize we have many reasons to keep reflecting on the role of peacemaking in our own time now. So let us show our appreciation for our award winner and the scholar J.R. with a round of applause.